We always like to have our own people give colloquia. We have a very interesting opportunity next week, October 26th. Luca Scarlett, who got her PhD in this department with Per Peterson, who's now been a faculty member at Wisconsin for a year, is going to be in town, is going to give us a colloquium, Hydrogen Isotope Transport in the Graphite Fuel Elements of Fluoride Salt-Cooled High-Temperature Nuclear Reactors. It'll be very good to see her again. She was here in August as well. So it'll be very good to get the experience of one of our own who's successfully moved into a faculty position at a premier program, peer program, and to talk to her and see her again. We have a special colloquium this Wednesday at 12 p.m. in 41 Evans Hall. Henry Sokolsky, the executive director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center, is going to be here. Every time you turn on the radio or about the any issue on nuclear proliferation, 50-50 chance Henry Sokolsky will be there as the pundit. He's actually going to, this will be co-sponsored by this department and also the Institute for International Studies down in Moses Hall. He's actually going to be giving away free copies of his book called Underestimated Our Not So Peaceful Nuclear Future, which is the topic of his colloquium. So we've been focusing on Iran, but there's lots and lots of other problem spots around the world that he's going to tell us about. So we are privileged today to have back Jessica Lovering, who was here last spring from the Breakthrough Institute. She received her bachelor's degree in astrophysics here and did a master's degree in astrophysics at Colorado. Actually worked on the New Horizons mission, which I had not known, which is going to fly by Pluto.
It flew by.
Ah, oh, that's right. That's right. That was very exciting. It's gone. And she got a master's degree in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, focusing on energy policy. And her title today is New Data on the Real Costs of Historical Nuclear Power Around the World. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you. Really glad to be back. Always love coming to Berkeley. I will mention I am Breakthrough Institute in Oakland, so if there's something here you want to talk more about, something else related to nuclear policy, just shoot me an email. I'll post my email address at the end. And I did want to give a disclosure up front that mainly what I'm presenting today, my big result, is a data set that we have curated over the past year and a half. So the result is the data. I've shown several things that I hope you find interesting that came out of the data, but if there's something else you want to know, you want more details about something that's up here, please stop me, because maybe there's something that you really want to know about that's in this data. All the data should be pretty new to you, so please interrupt. I also have a bunch of supplementary slides at the end that provide more details, so if you really want to know what the UK's costs were in 1967, we can go and look at that. All right, let's get started. So, there's a very common story when you're talking about nuclear economics that nuclear is really expensive, and it's only getting more expensive, and it's something inherent or intrinsic to the technology. So I put out just a couple of the really prominent papers you get cited all the time. The really dominant was a book called Charles Komanoff. Who's familiar with Komanoff? Okay. Bup-Darian is also a big one, and has anyone read Coomey and Holtman 2007? Okay. All right, so this literature is not that familiar. That's okay. It's all the same story. These two books and one paper all focus on costs in the U.S., specifically costs that start around the early 1970s. And that was where everyone's story came from, was in the U.S., costs just kept going up and up and up, factor of 10, and then we stopped building reactors because they got so expensive and we'll never build any more. So that's the story. In 2010, Arnulf Grubler released the French data. He had to estimate it from EDF budgets, and what he showed with a lot of manipulation is that it matches the US trend. So you'll notice here, his axes are scaled so that they match up. It looks a little different when you don't do that. And fit the story. So he's like, even in France, where everyone knows they have this really successful nuclear industry, they have really great standardization, they have this kind of command and control utility structure, even there they saw really significant cost escalation. So that's the story. One, just to hint at the problems ahead, in 2012, the French government did an audit of their costs and released actual costs for every reactor, and they look pretty different from what Grubler estimated, and I'll use those costs. But what we wanted to know was, this is just 2 countries, and the reactors represented in these 2 studies are about 26% of the reactors that have been built around the world. And it's just 2 countries out of about 34 that have built reactors. So everyone's using this to tell a global story. And we wanted to look at if we could figure out a more detailed story. So the work that we did over the last year and a half was to get real costs for completed reactors for as many as we could. Our original goal was all of them. It turned out it's very difficult in a lot of countries. But we did get complete costs for 7 countries. United States, France, Canada, Germany, Japan, India, Korea. We only got the first half of the UK before they liberalized their power sector. And after that, you can't get costs for those. So for a lot of this analysis, I won't show UK costs because we don't know their complete history. So this is a big improvement. This is 7.5 countries. The total comes out to 350 reactors. So it's about 65% of the world's reactors. That's maybe starting to get a global picture. And as you might have guessed, there's a much larger variety of stories and trends in there that don't fit with the US case. Okay. Really quick, we wanted to do apples to apples. So what we collected for every reactor is overnight construction cost. You can ignore this chart, you can look at this chart, but what overnight means is that you pretend that the reactor was built all at once in a single day, so you eliminate interest during construction, which is a big cost. But it's due to a bunch of other factors. So this is what the actual construction costs to build these reactors. And a lot of countries report overnight costs. Some report costs per year, and you can use inflation to work backwards to get overnight costs. Okay, so this is the old data. This is the data from Cooney and Holtman, 2007. And not the full French report. So this is the data that was presented in a lot of the studies that talked about the French data, but it isn't the full set that was in that government audit that I mentioned. So you can see that there's already really interesting stuff to learn just looking at the US and France. There's been a lot of papers written about that, so I won't go into it. But a lot of people see France as exemplary, the US as a disaster. And that is still pretty much the case, but you'll notice that this data doesn't start until about 1968, and it ends when France built their last reactor.
Excuse me,
Yes.
these all for 1,000 megawatt reactors?
Yes, sorry, it should say on the other chart, these are per kilowatt, so these are normalized. That'll be true throughout, and just to be helpful, the colors will stay the same throughout. France started their last reactor that has been completed in 1992. So there's a lot of time missing. So I'm going to jump to, when we include all the new data we have, this is what we cover. So there's a lot more, and then there's a lot more time covered. You'll notice that there's a lot of US and French reactors before that weren't talked about either. And there's good reasons not to include those. They were demonstrations, they were prototypes. But we want to have this full picture of what was happening as we're looking at how innovation happens and how that affects economics. So we wanted to include everything. So this is a lot. We're gonna break it down into smaller pieces so it's a little easier to understand. But very different, both from France, which you can see is really low, still really exemplary, and still very different from the US. So everyone else is kind of in between, but there's a lot of different stories in there. Yes?
Where did you get them used to?
Two sources. They are basically utility reports to the government, which is where most of the data comes from. It's usually in the country's language, so we had to have someone translate it, but we have that. And luckily with India, it was 2 independent reports that overlapped on 24 out of the 26 reactors. And the ones that didn't overlap, we trusted that they would match because the other ones matched. We're lucky there. Okay, so that was sort of chaotic, so I made this a rolling average. But I'm also just going to show it country by country. So we know what the US and France look like. And these are 3 other kind of early countries in nuclear in the West. So the UK is very similar to the US in its early days. It built a lot of demonstrations, a lot of small scale plants, and costs dropped dramatically. And we see that in the US too for the early plants. Unfortunately, we don't have any costs for any of the reactors that we're building here for the UK.
Excuse me, which one is Canada?
It's this brown.
So it's the top one or the
Top.
The top,
the
yeah.
top? Okay,
Yeah, let me use this one.
I'm not good color.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
So UK, Germany is this green. Germany didn't build that many reactors, and we don't have East Germany. That was a big exclusion. So not that many. But you can see a pretty similar shape, and maybe the UK would have followed this. Cost drop when you do the first couple experimental designs or demonstrations, and then when you start commercializing, they need to go up, and it's a different amount depending on the country. Yes.
The dates that you're talking about are the dates of start of construction?
That's the start of construction, yes, that is a good question. And there's a reason we chose start of construction and not commissioning, particularly for the US. It makes a huge difference because of 3 Mile Island. So those are very exciting. What's more exciting is Asian countries. So in orange we have Japan. And you can see Japan drops a lot, and then rises, and then sort of levels off. And I'll show more details on Japan later on. But Japan kept building throughout this. They didn't have the same sort of boom and bust like the US did. They were slowly building a few reactors every year for 30 years. And India is really unique because as some of you may know, they were locked out of importing reactor designs because they didn't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they built a lot of their own very small design, 200 megawatts. But for that and other reasons, they kept their costs very low. Now they're starting to import Russian designs, which are much bigger. I don't have costs for those yet because they are only just coming online now. And then South Korea is the big, exciting story that everyone wants to talk about because they've just seen costs go down and down. And they've just started really pushing out a lot of their standard reactor design. And then now they have a new design that's an indigenized version called the APR 1400, which they're starting to export to other countries. So, yes.
The first South Korean reactor was Korea 1, which started construction in 1974. It's only 600 megawatts.
Yeah, so this is a rolling average, so the first couple might be truncated.
Oh, okay.
I'll show every single one a little bit later.
Go back to the basic idea.
Yes.
The overnight costs, you take out inflation, or did you say you take out interest?
You take out interest during construction.
But which are real costs.
Yes, but you put it into the kind of the end year. So rather than have the amount of construction cost in 2005 and in 2006 and 2007, you put it all in the same dollars.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you, in some countries, you have an issue of litigation and all this. Can you break that out in the component? What was the actual cost versus the additional costs incurred by stretch out?
We don't have costs broken down. There's some, there's a study for the US, the DOE did, that breaks down costs into components, but for pretty much everything, all you have reported is final costs. Okay, and just to show, we have new data for countries we think we know a lot about. This is the US and France. The US is in blue, and you can see there's a sharp drop and then a really sharp rise. But even within that, it bounces around. And France drop and kind of slow increase. And note that the existing literature just looks from here onward and from here onward. So they kind of ignore that early drop. Yeah.
Now, these are probably Areva reactors in France?
Yes, they're all Framatome, which is now Areva.
And France is now building one, I think, in Finland that has gone way over cost.
Yeah.
Is it like, it's like at 9,000, isn't it?
Probably more than that. So this one here, which is not done, so that's an estimate. This is the same design, that's the EPR. When we look at the French reactor standardization, you'll see that come into effect. France did stop building reactors for about 20 years, and that plays a big effect. Okay, oh, sorry. So, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of factors that could be affecting costs. And it's different for every country. So, just to kind of lay your appetite for what could be done, or what could be studied in this data, there's a lot of different factors. So there's size of reactor could play a big role, standardization, utility structure, or the institutions that are building these reactors. Demand for power stagnated in the West in the 70s and 80s, and still, that could have a big effect. And we want to study all these things, but they're all happening at the same time. So I'm going to try and break them down into parts one at a time, and we'll maybe resolve some of that. But I wanted to point out something that makes, even if you're looking country by country, something that's complicating. So the US, we see this really dramatic rise starting from the beginning, basically, of commercial reactors. And this is construction start. So a lot of people attribute this, especially pro-nuclear people, say, well, it was 3 Mile Island, which happened in 79. So it looks like that wouldn't be the cause, but since this construction start, pretty much all of these reactors were under construction when 3 Mile Island happened. So that could have a big effect, and I'll show you a slide that digs into that. But in 1978, which is the year before, we had the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act, which started the U.S. on the trend to deregulation. Instead of the wholesale electricity markets, that had a big effect on how utilities were operating and how they were selling power. And I think that gets sort of undersold in its effect on nuclear and how much it costs, because utilities were starting to think not just that these plants would be a guaranteed source of revenue, that everyone wanted to build and all the ratepayers were going to fund, but now you have to think about it more as a business, and there were a lot of issues. There's also 1971 was the Calvert-Cliffs decision, which allowed legal intervention in the licensing process. So that sort of started stretching out the times of licensing approval. So that could have an effect as well. So a lot of factors, yeah.
What dollars are you assuming?
These are 2010 US dollars, sorry, per kilowatt. So just to look at the maybe effect of 3 Mile Island, what I've shown here is the cost, again, versus the construction duration, so how long it took. And about half the reactors in the US that are operating today were under construction during 3 Mile Island. So potentially had an effect. And so this is, red is reactors that were under construction during Three Mile Island, and blue is reactors that were completed and commissioned before Three Mile Island. And there's a big difference. It looks really dramatic, but hard to know what the factors were. And also, the U.S. didn't build any reactors that started construction after Three Mile Island, so we don't know if things would have stabilized once regulation stabilized. So that's why it's important to look at more countries. Okay, so as I mentioned, a lot of cost drivers that we want to look at. Eventually, we'll kind of pull these all together into a big regression study, code things for different utility structures. Right now, what I'm just going to show is visual. We can kind of draw our own conclusions. So feel free to stop and ask questions if there's something you like, you don't like. But things to look at: reactor size, economies of scale in terms of reactor size, but also economies of multiples. Building 6 to 8 reactors in the same site. Standardization, which is a little bit hard to quantify, but we'll try. Utility structure, I'm not going to analyze in this talk, but it, as I mentioned, could be huge in terms of who builds cheaply and who's expensive. And then technological evolution, which is the actual reactors you're building, how much does that have an effect? Okay, so first thing I want to look at is reactor size. There's an idea, especially in the US, that part of the problem is reactors got too big and too fast. So pretty quickly, I'm just going to go through what we're showing here is capacity. So this is the net electricity coming out of the reactor over time. So this is the US, and you can see that we grew pretty fast, and there's no standard reactor size in there. We're all over the place. Similar in Germany. There's kind of clumps up here, but really spread out very fast. In the UK, again, our data stops. We don't have a bunch in here, but look like they're on the same trend. Now, Japan is a little bit in between. You can see that they didn't grow as fast. They were spread out much more over time, and there's sort of hints of standard sizes. But they were building everything at once, so they kept building small when they were starting to build big. Okay, now to get to the countries that really had standard reactor designs. Not just standard designs, but they had, France especially had a roadmap for how they were transitioning to the new designs. So France started, like the US, early on with a lot of experimental reactors, demonstrations that they scaled up pretty quickly. Then they take a pause, and this is where they lay out their plan for how they're going to do nuclear power. And they decided they were going to move up in what they call paliers, so kind of like tiers. And it's very discreet. This is that EPR that's 1600, huge, and very over budget, even in France. So this is very different from what the US looked like, and maybe that's why their cost stayed so low. Canada is very similar, and it's very noticeable in Canada as well. They stayed pretty small. They have nothing over 900 megawatts. They also always built in pairs, usually less than 6 months apart in their constructions. Okay, Korea.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can I stop you one thing there with Canada? Those are the heavy water reactors.
Yes.
Is there a difference between heavy water and light water?
Many differences.
But I mean in cost.
I have not looked at it, broken it down by reactor type, yeah. There are some suggestions that heavy water is more expensive. Okay, Korea, very standard reactor size, and they started later, is also a big factor. And they don't have anything, they didn't do any small prototypes or demonstrations. They started by importing large Westinghouse designs and Areva designs and Canadian designs. So they tried everything. Yeah?
They seem to also be building in pairs. I don't know about Korea.
Yes, they are.
Co-located?
They're co-located. They're building in pairs. They're actually building in quads with plans to go 6 to 8. But yes, they. And India, I mentioned they have their own indigenous design that's 200 megawatts, and that's all they built for most of their industry. They couldn't import reactors, so they're very successful with their own design. These are Russian VVERs, so they're starting to import now, and they might be able to import other designs that are Russian soon. We'll see. Very, very standard and very small, which is unique. So I don't have any cost for Russia for reasons you might be able to imagine, but we do have capacities, dates for all Russian reactors, and you can see they're very standard size as well. Russia is also fun to look at because they built reactors in so many other countries that you can kind of get hints at how much their reactors cost, but hard to say. Okay, this is what it looks like all together. There is a general trend of going upwards, but people were building all sizes at all times. Okay, so were there diseconomies of scale? Did this growth in size affect costs? Have reactors become too big? Would it be better if we went back to maybe 800, 600 megawatts? Just a quick comparison to the airline industry or the aircraft manufacturing industry, which I study a lot, compare with nuclear. For a long time, planes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, until we got up to Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A380. Most people think the Airbus A380 is too big. It's a huge loss of money for Airbus. And now the trend, if you look at what aircraft people are buying, it's converging to a smaller size, so more like 150 seats. The A380 can hold 850 people. That's a lot, but most airlines actually want more in the 150 seat range, and you're now seeing everyone's kind of converging to that. It's much more flexible, it's much more reliable cost. So maybe we'll see that with nuclear, but at what size? Or maybe we'll keep a variety for different types of markets. And there's also lessons from mega projects. So, mega project is a project, initially the term was over $1 million. Now everything's over $1 million. So they're more like giga projects, or tera projects, but no one uses those terms. So things like high-speed rail, the Bay Bridge, skyscrapers, also less tangible things like hosting the Olympics. There's a lot of literature on why mega projects always go over budget and take longer. And the conclusion is not that we shouldn't build mega projects, because we're going to keep doing them. We need highway systems, we need power grids, we need these really complex things that cost a lot of money. But we need to figure out how to do them better. And some industries have. Some countries' Olympics are on budget and on schedule. So kind of lessons learned from that. So there's a lot of wiggle room for countries that do it better than other countries. Okay, so just to throw this data up there, don't worry, we'll dig into it. This is the cost for every country and the capacity. Do you see a trend? Not really. It's all over the place, and every country is different. So we'll break it down a little bit to see. In the US, it looks like there's a trend. As reactors get bigger, they get more expensive. Maybe the sweet spot for the US is like 600 megawatts. But so many other things were changing as reactors grew in size. Yeah.
Isn't it also, though, that the reactors got bigger with time?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And regulation was changing with time, and utility structure was changing with time. So it's hard to weed apart those factors. And you could, with a really good econometric analysis, I haven't done that yet.
And you might as well, you could do the same thing and show that telephones cause cancer.
Yeah.
The number of telephone landlines and the number of cancer incidences in the United States track very well.
So it's different for every country. France, bottoms out a little lower, but that's just because they built a ton of 900 megawatt reactors. Japan, as we've seen for everything else, they're just all over the place. Japan is pretty good at standardizing reactors, which I'll show a little bit later, but they have 13 utilities and many different people building reactors at the same time. But maybe it's 900. I don't know. And South Korea does actually look like they have economies of scale. Especially, they've had good success with the OPR 1000, which is 1,000 megawatts, and is based on an imported design. And now they're moving up to 1400, which is their indigenous design, the APR 1400. So they're going bigger and bigger, but they have huge power demand, so it makes sense for them.
Are these all commercial reactors?
Yes.
Some of these test reactors?
These are all, some of the really early ones, so if we go to US, some of these are demonstrations. We cut out any demonstration that didn't then become a commercial design. So like Peach Bottom and Fermi in the US, Superphénix in France, but it's just one or two in each country. But pretty much anything that happened after 500 megawatts or after 1970 is a commercial design. France, Japan, South Korea. So once again, South Korea really stands out. These are the other countries. You can see it's all over the place. India, just flat, doesn't matter, but it's because all they built was 200 megawatts. Yeah. So you can't really learn that much, is my conclusion. So maybe it's not about size, maybe it's about standardization. And I don't know where this joke came from. I heard it from an economist, or not an economist, or a senior editor at The Economist. So if you can read, it says, in France they have 100 kinds of cheese but only one type of nuclear reactor. In the US we have 100 different reactors but only one kind of cheese. And so this is often credited as being one of the reasons that the US has crazy cost escalation and France is really stable. The reality is not that severe. The US only has 44 different reactor models. And excuse the complexity of this chart. This was my own mental mapping. But this is when the US built different models of reactors. And how many they built. So there are some multiples. So we built 15 of GE's BWR4 Mark 1. We built 13, this is a Westinghouse design. They're 4-loop dry cooler. So there are some, but there's a lot, and these were all being built at the same time, 20 different designs by probably 50 different utilities, okay, less than that, but before they started to merge. So very hard to get learning in that situation. So. France looks much better. So they did, France had a fleet of gas-cooled reactors in the beginning when they were siphoning some off for weapons. And they did a couple experiments. This is an imported design, heavy water gas-cooled reactor, then an early fast breeder reactor. And this is when they start getting into their really standard designs. CP0, CP1, CP2, these are all evolutions of the same design. They built 6, 18, and 10 of them. And then P prime 4 rep 1300, they built 20 of. And this is the same reactor but with a more domestic supply chain. And then I don't have on here, they're just starting their next design, which is the EPR, which is 1600 megawatts. That started construction, I think, in 2005. And it's way over budget, way behind schedule. So they should have stuck with those earlier designs. So just to see what this looks like in terms of cost. So this is all France. Once again, overnight construction cost per kilowatt. But I've colored the different reactors differently. It doesn't really matter. You can see these early experimental ones, and the gas-cooled reactors are up here. And this is where you start to get those tiers. So this is CP0. You can see it's very flat. CP1 actually had some decline. CP2 bounces around a lot. And then P4 decline again. And then N4 is a little all over the place. And you can see they're building in pairs as well. Okay, so it looks, standardization looks promising. In Japan actually has a very small number of reactors that they've built. And they're mostly from two groups. So GE's BWRs, they go BWR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then not as linear as the advanced boiling water reactor. And then the other set is based originally on a Westinghouse PWR, but then Mitsubishi made a domestic design, and it's just called the M. 2-loop, 3-loop, 4-loop. But it's similar to the Westinghouse code. So I've colored them just broadly into blue and red. And you can see it's all over the place. You don't see any learning that much, but again, one of the issues with Japan is you might have, say, I think there's about 18 BWR4s that were built in Japan, but they were built by 3 different firms, so Mitsubishi, Toshiba, and Hitachi, and I think there was one built by GE. So you have all these different firms building them at once, so you get that same learning, and again, 13 different utilities, so not the same sort of standardization you would see in Korea or France, where there's just one utility and one builder. If you simplify it even further in Japan, just break it down into PWRs and BWRs. Maybe PWRs still a little better. Hard to say. It might be, for the PWRs, the only builder was Mitsubishi. So maybe that helped. Okay, Korea. You can see this early phase where they were building everything. Can-dos, Westinghouses, even a CP1 from Fromatom. And then they started building their own design, and that's all they've built. Although they do have 4 can-dos under construction now, but they're focusing on their own design, and now they're going even further with that. So there has been some cost increase, but it looks more like France, that kind of slow and steady cost increases. Maybe they figure out if their regulation a little better. There was some lax oversight in South Korea a year or 2 ago, but it's just the beginning for South Korea. They have 8 more of their new design, APR 1400 under construction, and they also have 4 APRs under construction in the UAE. So it'll be interesting to see how those costs translate. So maybe standardization doesn't help cost that much. It does look like it helps with construction duration. No, that's not the point I'm making here. As you get bigger in size, it takes longer to build. Should be obvious. But these aren't normalized, so of course it takes longer to build a 2-story house than a 1-story house. When you normalize it, it looks like size doesn't really hurt you that much. So this is years to build a gigawatt, and it levels off pretty well. So maybe it's a good reason to build bigger reactors or standard reactors. Cost versus construction time. Takes longer. If it takes longer, it costs more. But how much of that is due to standardization, due to size, hard to say.
And this is overnight cost.
It's overnight costs, yeah, but it still costs more. Because there's a lot of things in there. Parts change, suppliers change, if you take too long. So, more than that's anymore. And really quick, I know we're kind of getting data saturated. Just to look at the trend in construction duration. So, nuclear's still kind of expensive, but one positive story is that construction duration has really come down. And I don't know if it's the companies are getting better at building or that it's most of the builds now are happening in Asia where they're better building things on schedule. So as you can see, Japan, their costs were all over the place, but every reactor took 4.5 years to build, no matter the size. South Korea takes a little bit longer, takes about 5 years, still really fast. India's all over the place, that's okay. Their reactors are really cheap though. And this is something I wanted to highlight because it's not particular to nuclear. It's a very similar story for high-speed rail, skyscrapers, bridges, roads in both Japan and Korea and China. They might be over budget, they might be more than they said they were going to be, but they're always on time. And so it's a particular management style that we might want to learn from, and it's something that comes up in the mega projects literature as well.
Is
Yeah.
that dependent on litigation?
No, a lot of it has to do with how you write the contracts of who's building. So if you go over schedule, do you have to pay for that? Or is the government or the utility just gonna keep funding you no matter what? Yeah.
Does that have to do with supply chain management?
Yes, supply chain management, and you've heard me mention a little bit, Japan and Korea, India was forced to, but they started with importing and they tried to indigenize the design and also get the supply chain to be more and more domestic. Japan is one of the only suppliers of a lot of components in nuclear. They did that to build up their manufacturing industry, but it's something that Korea has worked really hard to do, and China now, every time they build a reactor, they say 60% domestic components, 70%. Our goal is this, 80% in the next 10 years. So they're trying to get the supply chain to be domestic. And even in the US, when we have a domestic supply chain, we still have problems because we're not building that many reactors. So yeah, supply chain is a big issue too.
Does that have anything to do with the size of the country, like physically? I mean, look at France compared to the size of the US. I mean,
yeah, I mean, China's really big. It has to do with whether or not you have the large, really the heavy industry, like steel manufacturing. The US doesn't have that anymore. Japan has been working to build that up for decades. South Korea really wants to do more heavy industry, so that's part of why they're pushing nuclear is to build up their advanced steels industry.
How many reactors are being built in this country?
In this country, 132 total.
No, being built.
Oh, being built 5. Okay, so that's all the data. I'm going to go really quickly into something I find interesting, I'd like to do more on, just to weigh appetite. So there's certain series of reactors where there's been a lot of different ones built in a lot of different countries, and I would like to further examine how that affected the cost now that we have cost data. So this is GE's BWR series. There's 92 reactors in 10 countries. There's a lot of different models. I do not know how different they are. I'm not a nuclear engineer. So I'm working to go through and understand like BWR4 versus BWR4 Mark II. I don't know. But we have costs for a lot of these countries. We can get cost estimates for these smaller countries that only have 2 or 4 reactors to see how they compare. But it would be interesting to know if you're building the exact same reactor in many different countries, how do those costs compare? And that tells you a little bit more about the supply chain and the construction firms in those countries. Similar to Westinghouse PWRs, there's 80 in 10 countries. BVER, obviously we don't have costs for any of the ones built in the former Soviet Union, but we do have costs for some of these other ones, like the ones built in Germany, Bulgaria, India, not China. But Russia is working more and more to export these designs, so it would be something we want to study. And how does that export model work to keep costs down? Okay, further work. I will say I am mostly a policy person and not a data person, so if any of this got you really excited, email me. Always looking for people to collaborate with. So I'd love to do a big econometric study. There's so many drivers, everything is happening at the same time, so it's really hard to pull those apart and control for different variables. But it can be done. There's a really good study that did it for construction duration for every reactor, which we have that data for. I would like to do case studies on the utility structure in each of these countries and how it changed at the times where costs changed. Another big thing is looking at indigenous versus import designs. If you're a new country starting a nuclear, do you want to just have Russia come in and build a reactor, or do you want to design your own reactor, which makes sense for you? That's more also a political question and an international relations question. but also an economics question. Obviously, the UAE took bids and went with South Korea because they had a really good record for building on time, cheap reactors. And then more work in this reactor model evolution. Are we getting to the point where we're going to be building the same reactors for a while? Or are we going to keep changing reactors? And is there a certain point where we should standardize and be like, no more, change, we're just going to build AP1000s for the next 30 years? Or should we continue to be looking for the best design moving forward? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'd like to find out. So, thank you. As I mentioned, I'm in Oakland, so if you ever want to talk, it's pretty easy. Send me questions. I also brought business cards for a check. And follow me on Twitter if you want to argue. Two more things to say. Breakthrough Generation is our summer policy fellowship. It's paid. You have to have graduated college. We also take current grad students. If you're more interested in the policy side, I encourage you to apply, or if you know other students who might be interested. We're going to start opening it up a little bit to people who want to pursue their own research interests, to be a little bit more independent, still paid. But it'll have to be pretty aligned with Breakthrough's framework, so I encourage you to explore more Breakthrough. I'm also applying, this is just for fun, I'm applying to finish my PhD in the Energy and Resources group here. So maybe I'll see you around next year. We'll see each other more colloquium. That's it.
Wow, great question so far. I see a lot of interest for more here.
How does this compare to, say, solar panels?
Oh, that's a good question. So this is all this data is in a paper that is in review, and we actually compare to solar panels, wind turbines, and coal plants in that paper. We should have that graphic. I will pull that up. If someone has another question, while I pull up that graphic. Maybe we got it. Solar panels start a lot higher, and they drop pretty dramatically. But that's just the panel cost, and the cost to actually install the product is very different based on the country.
But then you also have to look at the duty cycle and the life expectancy compared now to an AP1000 that may go for 120 years.
Yep, and the levelized cost of nuclear is still pretty good. Even the curated plant in
It must be a
Finland,
factor of 10 better.
not a factor of 10, but you're not factoring in sort of the grid cost of that intermittency yet. So, but just looking at levelized cost, the EPR is still cheaper than, say, solar in Germany, by a factor of about 4.
Have you done anything with energy return on energy investment?
We have not done anything with it. We read a lot about
Very
it.
difficult.
It's a little too far for any policymaker
It's very difficult.
to grasp. Yeah. Yes.
In Korea, about 3 years ago, Korea Electric Power made they said that they were paying, it was costing them 31 won per kilowatt hour. It was about 1,000 won per dollar, so 3.1 cents per kilowatt hour for nuclear. 61 won per kilowatt hour for coal-fired power, and 121 per kilowatt hour for oil-fired power, and they have all three.
Yeah, and that's a similar reason why Japan went with nuclear. They don't have domestic fossil fuels, or they're very liberal. I was just in Japan in May. I think that was before I spoke here, or after I spoke here. So Japan, with their nuclear shutdown, they import all of their LNG. And just to throw this out there, so I went to Hamaoka nuclear power plant, which is hoping to restart. And in the meantime, since it's been shut down, they're running these 2 gas plants. It takes an entire gas tanker to power that plant for 1 day. Now it takes 2 days to unload the gas. So they always have 3 in the port.
Wow.
Now, that gas comes from Qatar, and it takes 6 weeks for each tanker to get from Qatar. So I used to have the number, I don't. It's like 84 tankers are always on the ocean somewhere for this one power plant in Japan. that was replacing a single nuclear power plant. Now that nuclear power plant had 5 reactors, so it was big, but still. Just the amount of infrastructure to import all that LNG is mind-boggling to me. So if you're an island, if you're a high energy consuming country like Japan, it makes total sense. Even if nuclear is really expensive, it makes sense.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Now, Per is on your board of directors.
Yes, he's
or
a
the
senior fellow, yeah.
And he's a zealot, of course, about the high temperature fluoride self-cooled reactors and this vision of being able to take in modules basically on a rail car and then port them in, port them out with unloading. What has he projected if you actually want to power a city, St. Louis or some other municipal area, with just a little pipe organ and several of these things? What has he projected? Maybe the students know. What does he tell you is the projected cost?
I mean, honestly,
So what has Per projected the cost of the HFR vision of these sort of 50 or 100 megawatt modules that come in on a rail car and you just plunk them down?
So it's in line with current reactors, basically, US reactors, is what I figured. Again, it's an estimate.
So you did the estimate?
Yes.
Okay. Why is it not different?
Because it depends, I scaled it based on US construction costs,
Okay.
or at least what I projected historically.
But this will have a high degree of standardization.
Yes.
This will be a particular
Yes,
choice, basically.
but again, you don't know a lot of the construction costs,
Yeah.
supply chain.
and
all that
also,
is
yeah,
just
also
like-
like, there's first of a kind and then end of a kind. And we don't know, we can estimate, based on the materials, inputs, things like that. But a lot of it's not actually based on the technology, it's based on the construction system and supply chain. And one of the things we found really interesting, say with Boeing and 787. It's an amazing plane. Who's flown? Does anyone know? You've flown? You've probably flown on a Boeing 787. Very nice planes. Huge success. Boeing is still not making a profit on the 787. They need to build about 1,000 of them, and they're not there yet. And they're behind schedule. They're under delivering. But all of us who don't know, who don't work at Boeing, are like, it's amazing. It's a success and innovation. And it's a similar thing. Japan high-speed rail was a disaster in terms of cost. If they had known ahead of time, they wouldn't have built it. But if you've been to Japan, if you've ridden on the high-speed rail, it's amazing. It's a beautiful feat of engineering. The country wouldn't be the same without it. But if they had known how much it was going to cost, they wouldn't have built it. So it's an interesting problem.
Have them tell our governor.
Oh, California high-speed rail is going to be a disaster. But I hope it's built.
There's a data set called the Energy Economics Database that was.
Yes, that's where the chart I have of overnight cost comes from.
Okay, because it's very highly disaggregated down to, I think, five levels of, it's very nice, because that means you can pull out, the concrete, or you can pull out all the rebar, you can pull out all the valves and so forth. But it hasn't been updated, as far as I know, at least nothing public since 1991.
Yeah, the trouble is, in order to make that data set, it had to be anonymized. So it's for an average US reactor that was built, I think the survey, I can't remember how many reactors they cover, but it was built before the big bulk of the reactors finished. Companies don't want to report their costs. And if they, depending on what type of utility they are, they might have to report the cost, which is where sometimes we're getting costs from Vogel, but the US is the most transparent. In other countries, we might never know.
Yeah, I haven't heard you talk much about the difference between labor costs in different countries, but I know that labor is actually somewhat significant in the construction costs of a nuclear plant.
It is, yeah. So I know this is not the same,
What was
but
the question?
labor costs varying by country. It's a big question. It's hard because we don't have a breakdown of where things. So labor is a huge cost in the U.S. when it actually is broken down. One study I have seen is looking at the labor cost to build an iPhone, and they found that part of the reason, or Apple isn't building iPhones in China because of low labor costs. It's actually because of the supply chain. If you want to change the glass design on your iPhone in the US, you would have to find an engineer, it would take months to get the design. In China, it's like, who's the glass engineer? And there's like 400 people show up. And they're like, I can build it right now. And then we can give you 10,000 next week. So that supply chain for heavy industry and even high electronics is much greater. So it's probably different with nuclear because it's a much different supply chain, but I'm sure labor is important, but a lot of this is just steel and concrete, and that's what it comes down to. Yeah.
What do you figure the cost is, or the similar basis of this for the reactors being built in Georgia, the AP1000s?
Does anyone know those costs? I should know those costs.
They're close to 5,000 total.
I thought it was
I think
7.
they're more like 7. Let me pull
Yeah, they're
up.
not close, so overnight cost, not the actual total cost.
Okay, so it's more like 5.
Yeah, just for the overnight cost.
These numbers are much lower than I would.
They release the reports semi-annually.
I mean, why don't we just hire Korea to build all our reactors?
That's a question. And certain people in the U.S. are like, China's doing a great job. We'll just import Chinese reactors.
You know, the old joke from
Yeah.
the old joke from Uncle Duke in Doonesbury was, you know, hey, you guys built the railroads for us. Or I think it was we hired you to build the railroad, which I think was not quite correct. But
So I have costs for Vogel at 7,400. Summer 4,500, but I think that's out of date.
summer is what?
4,500, but that's from 2013.
Gee,
It's probably changed a lot.
God, that's cheap.
Yeah.
How much of this do you think is underreported?
A lot. Yeah, that's why I said in our study we only include completed. And when these are complete, we'll know because they have to report it.
Even some countries wouldn't they still tend to underreport?
They would, and that's, you can find costs for China. No one trusts them. So, they have a very strong desire, and even South Korea has a really strong desire to underreport because they're trying to export.
Sure.
But now we'll see when these things get built in the UAE what they actually cost. And it's going to be more than they cost in Korea, but it's probably going to be a lot cheaper than they cost in Europe.
2 more questions, one
Okay.
from Stu. Go ahead.
How much do you think solar is underreported?
Not as much, because it's a product, you buy it out of a catalog. There is a big problem with dumping, so the really low cost of solar in the last couple of years have begun because China made too much. And costs are going to level out when that problem is overcome. But the big thing with solar is you have the panel costs and installation costs. And even if the panels were free, the installation cost is still pretty high because you have a human being climbing up on a roof, and it's hard to do that economically.
But then you need the integration into the
Yeah.
grid, which is probably completely untransparent.
Certain studies, certain groups like EPRI looks at that. There are good NREL. There are people trying to understand that. I think it's not well studied, but I think there's a lot of great academics, a lot of them at Berkeley looking at that issue now.
Piece of advice, forget Dan King and apply to our department. You gotta get your PhD with us.
Yeah, that's a better
It's
idea.
yesterday's newspaper.
So I
But that's great, it would be lovely to have you here on campus.
Yeah, I'll be around,
That's great.
hopefully.
He actually has a 0% appointment in our department. But I actually tease him because in 4 years, I've actually seen him 2, maybe 3 times. I forgot what he looks like. That's not a secret. So, CUSD.
It's not